Hello everyone, this is Micah History, and welcome to part 4 of the famous ancestors of King Charles. So for those of you who do not know, you can check out the first part of this video series. Essentially, I am looking at what the king's DNA results would look like if he took a DNA test. And so to understand a little bit about his family history, we are going over some of his famous ancestors. So last time we looked at some of the important rulers in Western Europe, especially during the 12th century. And today we are looking purely at kings of France. So let's get to it. Moving on to King Philip II himself, he was another major ancestor of Charles, and believe it or not, was the first king of France. Wait a second, what do I mean by this? Well, he became king of the Franks in 1180, but 10 years later dropped that title and instead referred to himself as King of France for the first time in history. In 1209, he began the Albigensian Crusade to defeat the Christian sect known as the Cathars in southern France, which not only helped end that denomination eventually, but also strengthened his control over the region. By defeating King John's rivals at the Battle of Boudeville in 1214, he managed to take large parts of modern-day France back from his control. Under his rule, France became the richest and strongest country in Europe, and he used this to build a wall around Paris, restore financial stability, and reorganize the government before his death in 1223. However, this very famous French king was actually just 35.75% French, with the rest being a third German, 14% Dutch, 4.5% Occitan, 2.5% Norse, 2.5% Greek, 2% Lombard, 1.5% Breton, Sorb, and East Slavic, 0.75% Norse, and 0.5% English. Now, his grandson Louis IX of France is the most famous Capetian, becoming king at age 12 in 1226. His mother, Blanche of Castile, ruled the country until he reached maturity, defeated rebellious vassals, and finally completed the Albigensian Crusade. Once in power, he had to deal with rebellions by his more powerful nobles, while also dealing with Henry III of England's attempts to reconquer former English vassals. He was defeated at the Battle of Taillebourg, and France conquered Aquitaine, Maine, and Provence. Under his rule, France achieved a golden age, as it reached its political and economic peak, and Louis gained a lot of prestige for his skill in battle, as well as his fairness and moral integrity. He developed a French royal judicial system, which made him the supreme judge to whom anyone could appeal for the amendment of a judgment, and other charges included banning trials by ordeal and introducing the presumption of innocence. In addition to this, he is also one of the most famous crusaders, leading both the 7th and 8th Crusades, but both failed, being captured in the 7th and dying of dysentery during the 8th in 1270. He was seen as the quintessential Christian monarch, being extremely pious and rigorously enforcing Catholicism by enacting harsh laws against blasphemy. And for these efforts, he became the only king of France to be canonized as a saint. However, this famous French saint was only half French, with the rest being 16% German, 13.5% Dutch, 4.25% Occitan, 3.5% Aragonese, 2% Spanish, Leonese, and English, 1.5% Scottish, 1.25% Lombard, 1% Breton, 0.75% Norse, 0.5% Galician, Basque, Sorb, and Greek, and 0.25% East Slavic. Now, his grandson, Philip IV, would become King of France in 1285 and would be nicknamed the Handsome, as well as the Iron King. He sought absolute power and began centralizing France by weakening the power of the nobility and clergy. He also fought against the power of the Jews, who he expelled in 1306, and the Knights Templar, whom he also destroyed the following years because he owed too much money to both groups. His attempt to control the Catholic Church in France led to a violent dispute between him and Pope Boniface VIII. Eventually in 1309, he managed to move the popes from Rome to Avignon to have more control over them. Now, he was 46% French, 13% Occitan, 8% Greek, 8% German, 8% Dutch, 2.75% East Slavic, 1.5% Catalan and Aragonese, 1.25% Czech and Norse, 1% Armenian, Lombard, and English, 0.75% Serbian, Leonese, Spanish, and Breton, 0.5% Sorb, Scottish, Neapolitan, Galician, and Basque, and 0.25% Aragonese. So we can see over time that the amount of ethnicities of these different kings in France just became more and more complicated. Now, Philip VI of France would be the first French king of a new dynasty, the House of Valois. He became king in 1328, but this was immediately disputed since King Charles IV's nearest male relative was his nephew, Edward III of England, but the French nobles preferred his cousin Philip instead. Although Edward initially accepted Philip's succession, they got into several disputes, which resulted in the outbreak of the Hundred Years' War in 1337. Philip suffered several crushing defeats, such as the annihilation of the French fleet in 1340 at the Battle of Sluis, and then the Battle of Crécy-en-Land in 1346, and then the arrival of the Black Death only 2 years later just further devastated the country. In 1349 he bought Dauphiné and died in 1350, being succeeded by his son John. He was just 37.5% French, 12.5% Cuman, interestingly enough, 11% Occitan, 10.5% Greek, 9% German, 6.5% Dutch, 1.25% Russian, 1.25% Aragonese, 1% Norse, 1% English, 0.75% Ukrainian, Catalan, Czech, Armenian, Lombard, Leonese, Spanish, Breton, and Serbian, 0.5% Scottish, and 0.25% Sorb, Neapolitan, Basque, Hungarian, and Galician. So, crazy mix for Philip VI of France. Now, John II, his son, was in an even worse situation than his father, since he succeeded in the middle of the Black Death, which killed literally half of the population, and also had to deal with the peasant uprising known as the Jacquerie in 1358, along with mercenary bands that were plundering the country. Militarily, the French suffered a crushing defeat at Poitiers in 1356, and he was even taken prisoner, causing his son, the future Charles V, to become regent. Charles was only able to liberate his father 4 years after paying a ransom as part of the Treaty of Bretigny, in which France lost a lot of land as well. Nevertheless, in exchange for his freedom, his second son Louis, Duke of Anjou, was taken hostage, and after he escaped, John voluntarily returned to England, where he died in 1364. He was 51% French, 10.5% Occitan, 9.5% German, 7.25% Dutch, 6.25% Cuman, 5.25% Greek, 1% Aragonese, Norse, and Lombard, 0.75% Russian, Leonese, Spanish, English, and Breton, 0.5% Scottish, Serbian, Catalan, Czech, and Armenian, and 0.25% Ukrainian, Sorb, Galician, and Basque. Charles V was not unlikely like his father, and actually made efforts to restore French glory. He established the first permanent army paid with regular wages, which finally solved the problem of roaming mercenaries who were unpaid. Under the leadership of Bertrand du Guesclin, he was able to turn the tide of the Hundred Years' War, and by the end of his reign was able to reconquer almost all the land lost at the Treaty of Bretigny. He also restored the French navy and replenished the treasury, and by his death in 1380 had brought France back to a high point. Now he was only 43.75% French, just over a quarter German, 7% Greek, 6.5% Dutch, 5.5% Occitan, 3% Cuman, 1.75% Ukrainian, 1% Norse, 0.5% Aragonese, Lombard, Leonese, Spanish, Breton, English, Serbian, Czech, Armenian, and 0.25% Russian, Scottish, Catalan, and Sorb. Yeah, this is only going to get crazier every generation. However, all his progress would be undone by his son Charles VI, who succeeded him at age 12, and although placed under the regency of his uncles, by age 20 he became the actual ruler of France. In 1392, while leading an expedition against Brittany, he suffered an attack of delirium, during which he attacked his own men, and just months later nearly died in a fire caused by a torch brought by his brother at a ball. After this, he was once again placed under the regency of his uncles, and from then on alternated between periods of madness and sanity. His younger brother, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, grew in influence, but his rivalry with John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, plunged France into a civil war. To make things worse, his army was crushed by the English out of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, which resulted in him disinheriting his own son in favor of his future son-in-law, Henry V of England. But Henry's death in 1422 resulted in the House of Valois being given the chance to continue fighting in the Hundred Years' War, despite Charles dying the same year. Now, he was just under half French, 21.75% German, 8.25% Dutch, 6.25% Occitan, 5.5% Greek, 1.5% Cuman, 1.25% Ukrainian, 0.75% Aragonese, 0.75% Lombard, 0.75% English, 0.5% Czech, Norse, Armenian, and Scottish, and 0.25% Leonese, Spanish, Russian, Breton, Catalan, Serbian, and Sorb. That's a lot. Now, the fight to restore France would be led by Charles VI's son, also named Charles. Northern France was completely occupied by the Burgundians and English. He had been disinherited by his own father, and there was a civil war among his supporters. Now, in this terrible situation, he was saved by an unlikely hero, a 17-year-old peasant girl named Joan of Arc, who believed that God had sent her to save France from the English. This allowed Charles to be crowned king in 1429, 7 years into his reign. 6 years later, he broke the alliance between England and Burgundy, reconquered Paris in 1436, and used his newly organized professional army to drive out the English from France in 1453, ending the 100 Years' War. He died in 1461, having reunited France and made it stronger than ever. Despite this, he was actually only 30.75% French, and was 21% German, 9.5% Venetian, 6.25% Ligurian, 5.5% Dutch, 4.5% Greek, 4.25% Occitan, 3.75% Lombard, 3.25% Piedmontese, 3% Emilian, 2.25% Cuman, 1% Sardinian, 0.75% English, 0.75% Norse, 0.75% Ukrainian, 0.5% Russian, Aragonese, Czech, and Armenian, and 0.25% Serbian, Sorb, Scottish, Breton, and Catalan. So yeah, that's a crazy amount of ethnicities. Now, thank you all for watching and listening. If you made it this far, hopefully you learned a little bit more about French history and the important French kings of the Middle Ages. And I will see you next time for the next part of this series. See ya.